Radio Free Skaro.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Radio Free Skaro, episode number 738. I am Stephen in Edmonton.
Warren in Vancouver.
And Chris in Edmonton.
We hope this week finds you well, dear listeners, in the days that we live in. We had Steve Barry from Big Finish on last week, and from the get-go, I forgot that our whole modus operandi was to bring in Kieran Hyman and Richard Tipple to talk about the colorization of Day of Armageddon, and I never mentioned it till like 45 minutes into the episode, so I'm mentioning this off the very top. Paul Wilmshurst, director of Kill the Moon, Mummy on the Orient Express, and Last Christmas, stories that we'll be watching for the Miniscope next week, will be interviewed here on this very podcast beforehand, so that we can have that interview fresh in our minds when we watch those three episodes for next week. But it's another week with the COVID-19 pandemic swirling the world. It getting worse in places, it getting slightly better in places, particularly where we are, actually. I think the curve is starting to flatten ever so slightly. Everyone's still in lockdown for the most part. There are live tweet-alongs still happening. There was one on Saturday that will have happened by the time you listen to this, for The Doctor's Wife with Neil Gaiman, and Richard Clark was involved in it as well. Jodie Whittaker basically is spending her time doing wonderful COVID-19 messages as the Doctor for the BBC Twitter account, which is quite nice. Stephen Moffat wrote a short story called The Terror of the Umpty-Ums, which is actually for the 13th Doctor. So Stephen Moffat is proving once again that he can never leave Doctor Who. It will always be a part of him. And on that note, we bring in a guest to talk about his COVID-19 experiences and his new book as well. We all hear stories in the dark, and someone who we will never, ever let him forget that he was a part of Doctor Who, because we keep dragging him back into it. It's noted author Robert Shearman. Hello, Rob.
Hello. Hi there. How are you?
We're well. We're well. Coping.
Good.
Yeah, we are coping. We've been talking about. I understand a lot of podcasts and stuff just sort of like try to avoid it because this is the happy place, and we're just sort of like, it's all craziness and let's just talk about one thing. But I don't know. For me personally, I feel like it's a thing to talk about. It helps me cope with it, I suppose. Just sort of knowing more about it and just feeling more comfortable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, as well. I mean, I think that the biggest problem is the fear. I mean, I was speaking to a friend about it a few days ago who hadn't realised I'd had it. And their response, which was that, it was almost like they thought I just told them I'd climb Mount Everest naked. There was a sort of huge impossibility that I was discussing it quite dispassionately and I'd come through it and I could, because in their heads, because of the way that it's such a frightening time that no one quite knows how to react, they'd started to think of it as something that was going to be like Stephen King's The Stand, and that this was going to finish us all off. And the fact I was saying, no, I mean, I'm not saying it was particularly nice. I'm not saying that I'm entirely over it, but I can discuss it with you and I can make it feel normal, I think was very important. And I think that to be in denial of what we're currently going through seems insane anyway. I mean, I know that it's annoying at times, but it's almost all that my wife and I talk about and she, much more than me. I mean, she listens to the radio. She'll follow the news updates. I can't do that all the time because I don't want to be that depressed.
Right.
But at the same time, we still have to talk about it. We still have to actually accept that we're in this and find that sort of sane spine that keeps us going until it's over, because it will be over. We just have to be patient and deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that we're going to live in this fear because we're too frightened to actually acknowledge that something like this is really happening, that obviously is counterproductive. So it's, I think talking about it is very, very sensible.
Mm-hmm. Now, we brought you on for many things. Your new book, the fact that you're doing a target novelization for Dalek, which is coming out later. You've done commentaries for the 2 Dalek movies, which are coming on a Blu-ray in this continent, not in the UK, which we're very excited about. But in late March it was that you were never diagnosed with COVID-19, but you certainly displayed many of the symptoms and probably assumed that you had it.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of the trouble here is that you can't get tested. And so, I mean, it is possible. And I keep on saying to Janie, my wife, that I say, did I have it? And she said, yes, you definitely had it. And Janie had it worse than me afterwards. But because you can't get tested, because there just aren't the tests out there, and even NHS workers who desperately need to be tested can't get it, you still have this sort of little bit of a doubt that maybe you were just exaggerating all of the symptoms. But it wasn't very good. I mean, I had a bit of a fever for a few days. I had the shortness of breath. That didn't last that long, thank God. All the other sort of more annoying symptoms, like that constant dry, unproductive cough, which was, and just the basic weakness. I mean, I felt, I still do feel actually very, very physically weak. It's hard to do very much. And there's a tremendous brain fog, which I have mostly overcome, but for a long time it was very hard to concentrate at all. And my temperature was going up quite a way. And bizarre things like not being able to taste. Mm-hmm. I lost my sense of taste for about 4 days entirely, which meant, I mean, I didn't lose my appetite, annoyingly. I still was eating, it could have been a great way to have lost some weight. I just said, I don't want to eat anything, because I still thought, no, I'm still going to eat all this stuff. I just have absolutely no idea what it is. If I closed my eyes, I had no idea whether I was eating sweet or savoury. It was that was a strange thing. But it passed, and then Janie got it a bit worse than I did, which made me very worried. She had the fever for rather longer, and her temperature was higher. But she never coughed. She had other symptoms, but she never actually got that cough. And I think what I find odd about it is that I've got several friends who have now had it, and we've all had slightly different takes on it. There are people who were, not to go into massive detail, but were actually they were quite sick. I mean, they were throwing up and things, and I never had that, thank God. I mean, I'd have hated that. We read recently about one chap a doctor who got it, and he talked about, rather than losing the sense of taste, which is what most people get, he got the exact opposite. He got an extraordinary oversensitivity to taste and to smell, which again is also a symptom. So the symptoms can go both ways and be contradictory. And it almost feels like it attacks your most vulnerable spot. So for me, it's always I've got a very, very weak chest. So it's settled on that first. Mm-hmm. But it is manageable so long as you're sensible. What made it very obvious to me, and why I posted about it on Facebook when I became really obvious that I obviously did have it, was not that I wanted sympathy, because I was trying to let people know that I was genuinely going to be fine. I just had to ride this out. But what was very obvious was the way in that anybody who was more vulnerable, it would just flatten them, because it really does knock a punch. And I began to be very alarmed at the idea that, 2 weeks earlier, I was still going out. I mean, I was trying to be sensible, but I was still, if I had to, riding public transport. I was doing things which I now look back and I feel tremendous guilt about, because I was, at that time, it would seem, incubating COVID-19 without realizing it. And I just, and I forgive myself, because you have to, but I didn't want, I don't think people necessarily understand that that when you get it, it doesn't have to be something which you're frightened of. You just deal with it sensibly. But you should be frightened of the idea that it could be hard for other people. So that's the big concern. It's just making sure that the more vulnerable of us who can't fight it. And of course, there are always complications. I mean, the statistics of the fatalities here in Britain have become very alarming indeed in the last few days. Yeah. And it's easy to forget that, actually. You know, if you sit at home and I self-isolate quite carefully, and I feel more or less fine now, and you turn on the TV and then you see these staggering death statistics and you think, oh God, because it's easy to start believing to yourself, because you've overcome it, well, it's a fairly annoying cold stroke flu. But here I am, and I'm going to be fine. Mm-hmm. But other people won't be, and that's actually where the concern is.
There's of course also, think what you will about the man, but the extra attention on Britain these days with Boris Johnson having been in intensive care for it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I mean, Boris Johnson's father has made the somewhat tactless point, but I do take what he means, that it brought it home to people. But I think actually it already was kind of brought to home to most of us anyway. The fact that, I mean, you know, it's hard now to be in denial of it because it's so obviously it's what everybody in the world is talking about and will talk about for a long time to come. It feels genuinely surreal. Mm-hmm. That there is one thing that's affecting every single person on the planet. I don't think there's ever been a stage in history where that's quite been this way before. I mean, there have been things like this before, but the idea that we now, because of the internet, have that sort of constant communication, so we're aware of all that going on, and the fast spread of it is it feels really extraordinary. I was saying to you guys earlier on in a chat that I think what I find strange is the idea that whenever there's anything bad in my life before, or even if other people, you know, you could see terrible things on the news and just think, you know, people fighting in terrible civil wars, they could go somewhere. You know, I'm not saying that they could do it, but physically they could, if they wanted to, be on a beach in Barbados having a cocktail, if only they could get there. And the fact that at the moment there is something happening on the planet and there is genuinely no escape is very, very odd feeling. Mm-hmm. The idea that you're thinking, well, this country or this continent, we've got big problems, but there is somewhere where people are actually happily going out and going to the pub, and they're not. And that's the oddest thing, really. Yeah. I mean, the analogy I've used before with people is it's like we've suddenly been taken back to a time before they invented broadband, and we're all expecting to be able to use broadband. You know, if you're suddenly dropped back into the 1980s and everyone's going around saying, I can't get a broadband signal, and everyone's saying, there is no broadband on the planet. This is not where we are anymore. And where we are anymore is a place where there is no escape from a pandemic. And that's a genuinely strange, mind-boggling thing to conceive. I always had in my head a way that you could always escape from anything, really, somehow, and you can't now. But obviously, it's going to pass. It will pass, and we have to be patient, and we will look back on this, and we will chuckle, and we will write endless bad novels and movies.
They're
great. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be terrible, isn't it? I mean, that's the worst thing. Just all the things that are going to come out in. I mean, the instinct I have, I just want to write fiction now where everybody is constantly hugging. I don't want to write things in. I don't ever want even to use. If I write anything ever again where anyone's even on their own, I'm going to freak out. I want everyone in my stories from now on to be happy and to be partying. That's what I'm taking away from this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad you have. Obviously, you have a great perspective on things because you're Rob Shearman and you have a great perspective on many things. And I'm glad that you're.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
That you're much better as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
This so the new book, We All Hear Stories Today.
Yes.
Which is up for pre-order right now from PS Publishing.
Yes.
Does it actually take you 10 years to write this book? This crazy, massive, sprawling saga?
It took me, well, to be fair, it took me 9, but 10
Rounded up.
But 10 sounded better. It's about 9.5 years. About 2011. I just had this idea I love writing short stories, and I love writing sort of quirky things. And some years ago, I wrote a stage play adaptation of Don Quixote, which was set over. It was done outdoors, set over, I think, 5 acres. And what would happen is that you would see a scene, and at the end of the scene, the audience were invited to follow one cast member to one story of Don Quixote, or follow another cast member to another area. And then you would get subdivided again and again as you watch these strange stories. And I've always loved the idea of playing around with choose your own adventure formats. And it wasn't actually a terribly good play, but it was fun to try. And then years later, I did a Radio 4 series called The Chain Gang, which was based upon the idea of my doing an episode of drama and having a cliffhanger at the end of it. And then over the course of the next week, audience members would write in with their suggestions of where the story should go next. And I'd be given them by the BBC on Thursday. I'd have to write an episode that day, record on Friday for broadcast on Saturday. So the idea would be that you've got this sense of storytelling as being like a game, and we would share a co-credit, the writer who'd written in and me, and that would be fun. And I wanted to try and do a book that reflected some of that sort of sense of fun. So I had this idea of doing a book of 101 short stories, which is arranged like a huge maze. Mm-hmm. So you've got a prologue where a man has lost his wife. His wife has died, and he's very, very resentful. And he's resentful mostly because she was this very, very passionate reader. And he resents the fact that all the time that she could have been spending with him before dying far too young, she wasted reading these stupid fictions that she had, on the bookshelves. And one day, in a fit of grief, he takes them all outside and he burns them. He burns her entire collection. And then he feels this tremendous stab of responsibility and guilt because it was what she loved so much. And he decides he will try and find her somehow. And he joins a local library, and they give him this simple truth, which is that you can read everything ever written in the world in 2.5 weeks. Everything. Every single novel, if you do it in the right order. And the reason why all of us suffer, and why it took me a month to get through the Count of Monte Cristo, is because I'm reading it in the wrong order. I should have read it just after I read Black Beauty, and then it would have been easy. And so they ask him a series of questions for many, many hours, and then he gets his specific order of all the books in the world. And he spends 2.5 weeks reading everything in the original languages. He reads Crime and Punishment in the original Russian. It's easy because he's just read it in the right way, And at the end of it, he understands that all of world literature, everything ever written, is part of one big story. And everything which you've always thought was a really terrible book is actually a really important component of something, because it bounces off something else that exists somewhere else. And it's a wonderful experience that all creative art is part of one shared ambition. And that's great. And it makes him feel no closer to his wife whatsoever. And he also now realizes that any story ever told from this point on, he can't understand because it's now out of order. And he goes back to the library very, very distraught, and now at the end of his rope. And they take him to the back of the place where there's an old woman sits in the dark. And she has the final 101 stories in existence. And she says that she'll read them to him. At the end of every single story, there'll be 5 questions. And those questions and how you answer them will dictate which story you read next. And that way you'll find a maze of stories going on and on and on. And they might be funny, they might be horror stories, they might be adventure stories, they might be anything. It's about your own personal reaction to what you want to read, and how you respond to things which aren't that funny, but you thought were to begin with. And if you read all the stories in the right order, he gets his wife back. So it becomes this sort of strange quest where Scheherazade from the Arabian Nights is there, and she's telling these final strange, quirky things. So yeah, it took me, as I say, 9 years, because the stories are not short. I mean, they're short stories, but they're average about 6,000 to 7,000 words each. And there are weird stories. There's a story which you can only access if you cheat, and then the book tells you off, because if you found it, it means that you came out of the labyrinth to find it, and if you do that, it punishes you. There's a dark path where the stories get increasingly darker, and it keeps on trying to make you not go down this path. And it gets harder and harder to find those stories to go into, because it doesn't understand why you don't want to find happier things. And there's a story at the end which is made up of 101 different stories, so that there are stories within stories, and there are hidden bits, and it was enormous fun. It was trying to write a sort of like a huge gameplay of the way that we respond to the way to storytelling and to literature. And it's inevitably quite a long book. It's longer than War and Peace, which was a problem, because I was writing it originally for certain publishers in mind, who were very enthusiastic, and quite big publishers actually. And a few years into writing it, they began to realize just quite how ambitious this was, and that it's not easy to publish a book which is that length. And so I went instead to a sort of more like an art house publisher, who have made a beautiful book, actually. I mean, every story is fully illustrated, and they put it into 3 volumes which you read, but you read them at the same time, because of course, you might read story number 2 and it take you then to story number 86. So you sort of leapfrog between the books. And what's quite funny about it is that we got someone from the BBC actually to help us work out the mathematical likelihood of anyone following the same path, because of the number of parameters, the number of permutations rather that the book offers. And it's so large a number. I mean, it was eventually pointed out to me that if you took every single grain of sand on Earth and multiplied it by every single droplet of water on Earth, it's still a fraction, a tiny fraction of the number of permutations of reading this book, which means that as a result, when you pick up the book and you start making your own decisions about what you're reading, and because the stories alter effectively dependent on which order you read them, because they have different impacts. So the idea is that every time anyone reads the book, you are genuinely reading a unique book, because no one else will ever mathematically be able to read the same book as you. And that was fun to devise. Yeah. So it's kind of different, It's yeah. I mean, I'm very proud of it. It took me a long time to work on, and it was one of those sort of projects where doing it, people would occasionally tell me why, and it's partly because it hadn't really been done before. It's been hypothesized before. People like Jose Luis Borges would write about books like this in fantastical libraries. And I thought, someone should try it. And as I say, I love writing short stories. And over the last, the last several years before I began writing this book, I was winning quite a lot of awards for short stories. I won the World Fantasy Award and Shirley Jackson Awards. And I began to realize that if I were ever going to be in a position to do it, to actually pull this off, it would probably be now, while there's an appetite for that sort of short form fiction by me. I mean, it took much longer than I expected. I mean, I thought it would take me maybe 3 or 4 years, and it just took me much, much longer. But it's a strange piece. But it's like it is like a big adventure. And there's, it sounds arrogant to say it, but there isn't really any other book like it. I mean, it is a very bold thing to have done. And for years I was telling people about it, and they would say, oh, okay. And they couldn't really visualize what it was until eventually I was able to say, okay, well, the book is now finished. And then they saw it and said, oh, God, you actually really did do that. Because they were assuming, I think, that the stories would only be 100 words, or there'd be a paragraph, or it would be a lot smaller than it actually is. But it is rather a, yeah, it was quite fun. It was, I mean, I'm so glad it's over. I mean, yesterday we actually released it, and I can't tell you how emotional that felt, that something which had been something I'd been telling people about for years, and they'd always kind of never believed that I'd ever reach the end of it because it was so crazy. To actually know that it's no longer mine, but other people can now read it is, I'm actually very, very moved by it. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, you're always kind of moved when something that you've done is released. You always think, you know, it's always a very, very strange experience. But in this instance, I just feel like it's like a decade of my life has been sliced off, and people can now read what I was up to. You know, people say to me a lot on Twitter, you know, why don't you do Doctor Who anymore? The answer was this. I was doing this crazy book. And I know a lot of people would probably say, yeah, well, we'd rather you did Doctor Who, frankly. But I am very, very proud of it. It feels like a big personal statement. Mm-hmm. So yeah. So that's available.
Yes.
For people.
Yes. So when is it actually? So it's for pre-order now. When is the actual release date? Do you know that yet?
Well, it should be in a couple of weeks or so that they'll start arriving. The problem that we've got is it's coronavirus stuff. So the book would have been on sale at this convention, which was meant to be next week, StokerCon. But because of what's happening, printers are being a bit slower. I suspect that the book will probably start reaching people later in April. But I mean, it is very, very much there. It's just I haven't seen a physical copy myself yet, but I know that it's not a long wait. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's there. It's good. I mean, and there are different editions. I mean, there's a deluxe edition which is actually now sold out. It sold out very, very quickly. But there's also a hardback edition of 101 copies only. But there are tons of paperbacks, and that's what people probably should buy because it's more sensible and it's cheaper. But yeah, it feels weird to talk about it because it is crazy. It's a crazy idea. But as you know, but the way I simplify it for people, because obviously I don't normally bang on like that for so long. I say it's a sort of it's a modern day Arabian Nights rewritten as a choose your own adventure.
That is
you've got tons and tons of stuff.
Absolutely.
And you can have lots of fun with it. And it's quite funny and it's quite scary in places because I tell horror stories and they're quite gruesome, some of them. And the idea is it keeps you guessing all the way through about what you're getting next, because stories that start out seeming like horror stories are actually comedy stories. The stories which feel like they're going to be nice and gentle become quite strange halfway through, and it's designed to sort of keep you on your toes a bit. And then, as I say, at the end of it, you get quizzed about it, and so yeah, it's fun. Hopefully, it's good fun.
It sounds it. Erica saw this yesterday as it launched and was immediately excited by it, and so I feel like perhaps a birthday present. I'm spoiling the surprise right now, but is in order by getting a copy of this. So
well, please, no. I mean, I would be delighted if you did that. I mean, obviously, I would feel sorry for Erica, but But I'd personally be absolutely thrilled. Yes, so thank you for that.
Absolutely. We all hear stories in the dark from PS Publishing, available for pre-order. Links in the show notes, I believe, to the actual pre-order. I know there's a newsletter link,
Yes, there's also a big newsletter that they brought out which explains the book in greater detail and gives you a link to. And there's an interview with the illustrator. You can see lots of the artwork. You can read the prologue, and which explains the setup. But yes, there's also a pre-order page. You can go there and buy it if you so wish. And if you do, thank you very much. I'd be very grateful.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Well, the We All Hear Stories in the Dark is available for pre-order at the very least. As I said before,
Thank
links
you.
to the show notes. Rob Shearman, thanks a lot for dropping by to talk about your COVID experiences and, of course, the book as well.
Thank you so much. And it's kept my sanity going speaking to you guys, because I was going to go mad today in the lockdown, but I thought, I'll hang on a bit longer. So this has actually been a wonderfully mentally therapeutic thing for me. I'm annoyingly serious, but thank you so much.
We're glad to help. This is why we're doing this, is bringing on people to just talk through things, because a lot of people are in lockdown and having a hard time not talking to anyone. So we're happy to provide a service.
Please all keep safe and well, and obviously that goes to anyone listening as well. And we can get through this. I mean, obviously, we are going to get through this, and we will look back on this and we will find it interesting, I think. Mm-hmm. So take care, everybody.
Rob's great. I'm glad that we could help him out in that regard, just to have someone to talk to.
Rob talked about, the simple joys of things like sitting in a pub and having a pint, and it's been a long time since I've done that with him, and I do miss that as well.
Yeah.
Or at all.
But hopefully this podcast, this bumper-length podcast that we're chopping out to you there, folks, is helping you get by. Just two or three more things with the news, and then on to Paul Wilmshurst talking about his time on Doctor Who. Big Finish has announced Wicked Sisters by Simon Gary, or another person who's been on this podcast, is a story coming out in November, I think it's coming out, with the Fifth Doctor and Leela, Louise Jameson as well.
I'm shocked it took this long for this to happen.
for Leela and a different talk. Yeah, this does seem
for
kind
Big
of
Finish. Well, she's been in a War Doctor.
She's done the Gallifrey stuff.
Yeah, obviously, but with the Fifth Doctor, it's just like, you feel like that would have happened already, but it hasn't.
Seemed kind of a natural thing to have happen, but now it has. So there you go.
It has. It's available for pre-order. As I said, November 2020 is when that comes out. One of the things that we talked about earlier is that An Afternoon with Graham Harper, directing The Doctors, which is a thing that Who 77 Promotions was putting on at I think it was probably April. Well, it's been postponed now till November 15th. Cross our fingers that November 15th is still a viable date for anything to happen at this point. But links in the show notes for details about that. And then the most tangentially related celebrity passing, Honor Blackman, who was, of course, famous for James Bond and so many other things, and was in 4 episodes of Doctor Who in 1986, and thus warrants mention on this podcast, has passed away. At what
I think also don't forget the Avengers as far as her
Avengers,
her genre participation goes.
Yeah, the first the co-leads in the Avengers. So she passed and received a lot of acclaim, obviously from many, because I know her as Professor Vasky from Terror of the Vervoids.
Yep, same here.
Yeah, because we're Doctor Who fans and we only see some of these people in Doctor Who, so please bear with us when it comes to that. But she was great in that. So anyway, that wraps up the news, such as it is. After the break, Doctor Who director from Series 8, 3 stories, Kill the Moon, Mummy and the Orient Express, and Last Christmas. It's my chat with Paul Wilmshurst. I'm joined by Series 8 director and the Christmas special as well. 3 stories back in 2014 and none since, but we'll perhaps get into that as to why he has yet to return to Doctor Who after being so keen to be on it in the first place. It's Paul Wilmshurst. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Stephen.
How are you doing in London, being locked down like the rest of us in the world?
Sort of staying afloat, doing my best. I have a little bit of outside space, so when it's sunny, there's a chance to do that, and getting on with some reading and a little bit of writing. Mm-hmm. But it's a strange time, and it's a frightening time.
It is. What has the effect been on your industry? I guess you're a freelance director, so you basically go where the work is, and when there's no work, there's nowhere to go. So how are you coping with that, and how's the industry coping?
The industry basically shut down. I mean, it shut down. It was a very sudden, very intense kind of shift. I mean, I think within a week, most people, certainly in drama, and quite a lot of people in documentary and factual as well, found everything just kind of, the world changed. It didn't feel possible to continue working the way we were and maintain social distancing or any kind of adequate safety. And what the whole thing has made very clear is how precarious people's lives are and how precarious the whole structure of the industry is. It relies massively on freelance labor. Crews are put together out of people who are available, and we all do what we do and then disperse and then get reconfigured. And that lack of stability in people's working lives is often tricky anyway.
Yeah.
And people go through periods of working and periods of not working and have to somehow, pay their bills and stay afloat and keep the whole thing going. But it makes people very vulnerable at a time like this. And so there's a lot going on at the moment in the industry with people trying to support each other and kind of there's a government scheme to support PAYE workers and also the self-employed, but not everyone working in television is covered by that scheme here. There's a lot of online support, and there are a lot of organizations that most of us are members of that have been helpful. Mm-hmm. But it'll be interesting to see when this all breaks down and we get through it and come out the other side. It will be interesting to see whether it produces change as well in the way that people view the companies they work for and the structures they're in. It doesn't seem like it's all quite right at the moment, but so many things don't seem that way. So it's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, I said this on the podcast a couple weeks ago about how whenever I watch like science fiction and like it's in the future, or even the near future, and it seems like a lot more utopian, and like there's been a big massive shift somewhere, because it's easy to sort of think of that and just set it in the future without having to think of how you got there. And I always thought, well, if society was ever to change in such a way, they basically, like, I can't see how it would happen organically. Basically, things would have to stop, and then we'd have to start again from an entirely new basis point. And well, this is humanity's chance now, in a way, to perhaps look at who is driving the world right now, and it's like the truck drivers and the healthcare workers and the people who are stocking shelves at the grocery stores. I mean, it's those people right now are keeping the world going, essentially, as we all sort of have to hunker. And so it'll be interesting to see that the people who have not necessarily been looked after by the social system are the ones Absolutely. That will hopefully be rewarded and looked upon more favorably when this is all over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really clear what's valuable and what's necessary, and it's also really clear how people are treated and how they've been treated is kind of going through quite a kind of radical shift at the moment, and I hope that sort of kind of becomes concrete. It is, it's the relationship between what we're living. I mean, in terms of, what we're talking about in the in the interview, I mean, in terms of science fiction and this reality, it is absolutely one of those sort of times when you find yourself going, thinking thoughts about how do things structure, how could they be, why do we live the way we do, which is all surely what good science fiction is always about.
Mm-hmm. Speculating it a little bit and just sort of like tying it into the TV industry. I mean, Doctor Who was slated to resume production in September. I don't know what anything looks like right now, but like hypothetically, how long would it take, do you think, for like any TV production to say, okay, now it's safe to work again? Like how much organizing and reorganizing and everything else would it take to sort of say, okay, now we're ready to like make a TV series or a movie again? Like, how is that a quick process, or is that something that would be months and months of having to set up?
No. I think it's an amazingly quick process. I mean, one of the things that is one of the strange specialist skills that I think groups of people working in television have is the ability to form tight organizations very quickly with the groups of strangers and starts building and spending and planning at great speed, and get things done very fast. So, you can guarantee that the scripts are still being written. People are making plans. The writers of this world are not going to be sitting in their gardens in the sunshine.
Right.
So there are going to be scripts and there are going to be shows ready to go. The question is really what will have happened to the economic structures that kind of fund it, because the broadcast channels here are in terrible trouble. The only way to get out of a recession is to invest and to do stuff. Mm-hmm. So I hope that when it all finishes, there'll be a kind of boom in production. But I'd expect things to happen very fast, and shows to be suddenly up and running and hiring and looking to go into prep and looking to be, it's like if the world becomes clear again and there are safe ways of working, then within a week I'd expect things to be up and running.
Interesting. Well, that's good news. And in a desperate attempt to segue into the topic at hand, at least the moon isn't about to crumble into dust in the sky. And
as far as we know,
that would be the topper of everything, I suppose. But yeah. But yes, Doctor Who. You directed 3 episodes of Doctor Who in 2014. You wanted to direct Doctor Who before that, and you were indeed a fan of Doctor Who well before you even started working in the television industry. Isn't that right?
All true. Yeah. I kind of grew up, like I think most people did, with it kind of occupying quite a strong place in my imagination. And I have happy memories of hiding behind the sofa and it was, it's a very special thing. And then from when Russell T Davies got let loose, kind of bringing it all back to life and playing with the new incarnation, I was a huge fan. I just thought it was really exciting times. And I've got children who are now 19 and 16, so they were growing up just through the glory years of David Tennant and Matt Smith and through into Peter Capaldi. And that was also part of it, because it became, watching Doctor Who is just one of those kind of things you do as a parent that is exciting, because you're kind of reliving your own childhood and everything's changed and handing on. And mm-hmm. So we'd done all that together, and we'd got our favorite episodes and our favorite experiences, and I'd watch them get frightened, and it was all fun.
And so you reached out, in 2010, I think, to maybe start working on the show to Marcus Wilson, was it?
That's yeah, indeed. Well, I met Marcus, and that didn't work out, but I was really keen. And then it did this time with Pete Bennett, who was the producer who interviewed me
for Peter Capaldi's first season.
Yeah,
just after the 50th anniversary, of course. Did you had known that? What was the timeline of that? Like, Capaldi was cast, but you obviously hadn't really seen much of him when you actually agreed to be on Doctor Who, right?
Except in all his other shows. So I was very aware of him as an actor.
Yeah,
I didn't know what he was going to do with the role, but it was exciting to think that he'd be doing it, because it's like he's very special.
I think Jamie Matheson got the direction of writing an Dr. House, basically Hugh Laurie's House, over which I can't actually. There's not much of a dissimilarity between the two now that I think about it. He apart from the accent, of course. But did you have an idea of perhaps? Any idea at all what kind of Doctor he would sort of bring to the series after, sort of, as you say, sort of rediscovering the love of the show with people like David Tennant and Matt Smith?
I didn't know what he was going to do exactly. I think he's a very incredibly versatile actor. So that he can be florid. He can be obviously everything he did in the thick of it is probably the most inspiring thing in British TV, because he was so verbally coruscating. There was just so much kind of pent up and acted out disdain and contempt and fury and intelligence. But then he can also be terribly elegant and calm and kind. So, it's like, what was he going to do? And it turned out he sort of had everything when he became the Doctor. And there was a kind of distance and otherness at times. And then also this sort of really playful warmth. Mm-hmm. he could be avuncular and he could be 1,000 years old and utterly disdainful. And I think he managed to sort of flip between those in seconds.
Yeah, he's very good. So when you were told about these, I mean, did you know, what did you know about the stories basically when they said, okay, here's your block, these 2 episodes? I mean, how much did you know about them going in?
Very little. I knew who the writers were, Jamie and Peter, and I knew the titles. And at the time when I said yes, they obviously hadn't written their first drafts yet. They were still working on them. And so it was basically the kind of the elevator pitch, their track records, and the promise of what there would be to do with those things. So Mummy on the Orient Express kind of speaks for itself.
Right.
And you can sort of imagine something, and it was much more than, but what I imagined was fundamentally what it turned out to be, but only without any of the detail or the wit or the kind of, what Jamie did with it was amazing. But you kind of, roughly what you're going to be playing with. At a very practical level, it meant the whole episode sounded as though it was going to be on a train. Mm-hmm. And the train was, at a practical level, more likely to be a studio set than the actual Orient Express, given that it was going to be in space. So that was then about, the things that defined it were the wit and the characters and the premise of who the mummy was, what the mummy did, and how it killed people. And the challenge for Michael Pickwoad was to design something that was like the Orient Express, but just a little bit bigger so we could work, and that could be both retro and have elements of space, and obviously make the transformation in the final act when it turns into the laboratory. Mm-hmm. And he and his team were amazing. I mean, they built all that, and they were building separate carriages at different times, so because there's a sort of limited number of studios on Doctor Who, and they're always all busy and all have sets in. With Kill the Moon, the first question I remember asking Peter was, is it all going to be in a moon base, or is it going to be on the surface of the moon? And he said, yeah, there's quite a lot on the surface. And it's like, okay. And I'd done a previous show in Wales, a thing called Da Vinci's Demons, and we'd ended up filming in one of the classic Welsh quarries. And it had been lovely. I mean, and I know they are amazing, the quarries, and there are amazing things you can do with them. And in that, we turned that into a Transylvanian mountainscape with people in an utterly different landscape to the one that it was actually there in Wales. So, with set extension and so on, that kind of granite base is incredibly helpful, because it gives you a shape and it gives you a sense of something real. Mm-hmm. But it felt exciting to try and do something else. I remember leaving the meeting and wandering away and thinking, if we're on the surface of the moon for a reasonable amount, maybe we could do something fun here. When I was a lot younger, when I was in my 20s, I'd been on holiday in the Canary Islands. I'd flown to Lanzarote and by myself, and just sort of hitchhiked around. I hadn't really made any plans. I just got on the plane and landed, had a backpack, and sort of walked around and slept in a building site, I think. And then I got a lift from someone and did some traveling around. And it was a really nice place. Mm-hmm. And it was mind-blowingly other. You can travel through the volcanic park. You see this landscape that is very, very bewitching, and very, very cold, and it felt almost unnatural. It's like it's the product of an eruption nearly 100 years ago, I think now, most of it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it had got into my mind, and I remembered that, and I had a wonderful time just wandering around and taking some photographs and just sort of imagining that I was on another planet when I was there back in my 20s. And I remember at the time I was working as a journalist, but I remember thinking what an amazing place it would be to shoot science fiction. Mm-hmm. Like, I wasn't the only person who thought of it, and other people had used it, it turned out. But you know how that thing when you're young and you're just kind of going, hey, I've had a really good idea. Someone should do this. Anyway, cut to like 20 years later, 30 years later, whatever it was. And I thought maybe we could do that and make, it's like, I didn't know a lot about the Doctor Who history. I didn't realize Doctor Who had already shot in Lanzarote all those years ago, but it seemed to me it would make an interesting moonscape. So I kind of went on the internet and grabbed some photographs, sent Pete and Tracy, the line producer, a kind of a little presentation, and went, what if we did this? It could be quite fun, and maybe we could do it just for a few days, and it might make a change from Welsh Quarries. Mm-hmm. And they jumped at it and sort of started looking at the budget and working out how to make it work. And within a week or two, the four of us, I think, because there was Pete and Tracy, and then Ashley, who was the DOP, Ashley Rowe, mm-hmm. They'd kind of figured out a way that they thought maybe it would work, and that we should go out and do a recce and have a look around. The other thing that we decided before we went out there was that we had to talk to Ashley about lighting, because if you're going to shoot in Lanzarote, the one thing that wasn't going to be possible was going to be to shoot at night. So we would need to shoot day for night, or at least day for moon day, with a black sky. So we had to sit down with Ashley and sort of check that this would work for him. So we met up with Ashley and sort of said this was, oh, excuse me, my cat has joined me, and said, look, this is what we had this idea. We thought maybe we could go there. And so before we'd finished, he was going, well, the thing is, because the light on the moon is hard sunlight. Uh-huh. So you'd have to shoot in the daytime, and then you'd get the hard light and the hard shadows, and then you'd just do sky replacement. And we all looked at each other and smiled and went, great, let's go to Lanzarote and have a look around. And sure enough, I mean, he made it sound simple. And in a way it was, because as long as, I mean, we limited the number of shots in the end that had sky in them, but did enough establishing shots where you could see the sky, and then, replaced it with black and stars and a distant Earth. As long as there's a hard line to the horizon, and as long as you've seen that a few times, the rest of the time you're shooting into the rock and into the lava, mm-hmm. Or inside the crater. And it kind of, I felt quite convinced that we were there after a while. I don't know how it felt for other people, but it seemed like a practical way to achieve something where, apart from getting the team out there and getting all the equipment out there and getting the door of the space shuttle and the costumes, which basically involved driving a couple of large trucks down to Spain and then putting them on a ferry, and getting them over to Lanzarote, and then the rest of us flew out and joined them. But apart from that, it was relatively simple, sort of.
Yeah.
Except for all the things that were complicated, like we only had, I think, 3 days to shoot there, because it was much more expensive than shooting back in Wales in the studios. Mm-hmm. So we had to get quite a lot done quite quickly.
Yeah, because this is it looks great on screen, but then you look at the behind the scenes pics, and there's a whole crew of like 30 or 40 people. There's, as you say, like the set bits of the outside of the shuttle that you need to see, and the outside of the moon base. I mean, it purely logistically, it's a lot more than just taking a camera and a few actors to Lanzarote. You are basically moving an entire production to an island in the Atlantic Ocean. And like, what kind of contingencies do you sort of have to prepare for? Because it's not like you could just sort of nip back to the studio and grab a prop or something if you've missed it. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could go wrong that you have to prepare for. Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't really have many contingencies. We only had the limited number of days to shoot. Mm-hmm. We had the spacesuits. We had those little bits of the set. I mean, most of the space shuttle and most of the moon base were built later in CGI, but obviously you needed the physical steps to step up and in. And so we'd done some work to establish what was going to be necessary physically in order to get those shots. Mm-hmm. And then it was really a matter of just making sure that we got everything in the time that we had. But everyone just like really bust a gut to get it done. I mean, the hardest thing, I think, was the heat, and the heat for the people who were inside the spacesuits. So, yeah, I mean, Hermione in particular, I think, found it quite stressful, and she was amazing, really, because it's like, you put the helmet on, and
it's like there's a machine to help you breathe. It's almost like scuba diving. And the spacesuits were thick and heavy, and the sunlight was harsh, and everyone was out walking around in that hard sun. So,
but they had, at least they had like little cooling tubes in them. I saw on the Doctor Who Extra. Capaldi and Jenna Coleman were sort of like, "Ooh, this is," they actually pump cold water in through that. So that at least that helped a little bit, right?
It helped a little bit, but I think it wasn't always completely comfortable.
Right.
But no one ever complained. I mean, they were all amazing.
Mm-hmm. It looked great, and it's fascinating to think of how simple it is that you can go to a volcanic island in the Atlantic Ocean and have it just sort of with grading and sky replacement change it to the moon's surface. But then, today you look at how they shot The Mandalorian and every that Star Wars special that's on Disney Plus now, and how they use a new process called stagecraft, where there's this panoramic LCD screen that's behind them, and everyone just thought they shot on like some locations and stuff, but it looks fantastic and believable. If you were to make Kill the Moon today, do you think you would go that route, as fantastic as an actual location would be, or how do you think you'd do it?
No, I think there's something properly Doctor Who-ish about having a tangible space. It felt right to be trying to achieve most of it photographically and in relation to a set. I think once you can have anything, it's actually less scary. Mm-hmm. So our moon doesn't look like the real moon because it's a volcanic landscape, and it's got different, the crevices and things, and the encrustments on the rock are slightly different, but they had their own texture, and it felt like it was our place. But also, I think there's something about having actors in a space and being able to photograph them in a space, and the space being real and them responding to that, and finding shots because, the light is over there and someone's coming towards you. I don't know. I like all that. I come from a documentary background, and there's something about relating your photography to what's in front of you rather than everything being completely made up. I find inspiring, and so I think it's the combination. It's it's like we storyboarded and we planned and imagined things, and then tried to get those, but also to do them in relation to a physical space.
Mm-hmm. That is proper Doctor Who in a way, isn't it? It's you need to have that quarry, no matter what country it's in. That quarry is important.
Yeah, and it was just trying to find the like what's the best quarry in the world, and that's probably one that's really a volcanic, a volcanic park, and it was the one place in Lanzarote that they let us film. I mean, there are other parts of that volcanic park there that are amazing, but protected. And the one that we were allowed to use was perfect for our, it gave us everything we needed. Because the other thing that was complicated, and again, it's this thing about, do you just imagine it and then do it in a computer, or do you do it for real as well, was the whole question of the giant spiders.
That's right, which are a mix of both practical prop and CG. Peter Capaldi sort of thought of it as a rite of passage to have to wrestle with a rubber monster. So I think he quite enjoyed it. But how did you feel about that?
And he was there was something so lovely about seeing him wrestling with a rubber monster, and also and doing it in relation to Plan 9 from Outer Space. And he was telling the story, in terms of what does it do? Well, it doesn't do anything. And that, everything, all its movement would come from him. And that was like, as you say, like a rite of passage, but also like a kind of challenge, because he's very precise with props and very interested in what you can do with props. And seeing him fighting and wrestling with the rubber spider, and then doing a take with no spider at all and taking it out, and being able to drop in the CG spider, but he got his movements, and we had something to edit with the rubber one. I mean, I think what happened roughly with the spiders was that we ended up shooting, I think every time there was what in the end became a CG spider in the show, there had been a shot with either a rubber or an animatronic one before that. And we used those to edit, and we tried to limit the amount that you saw because they weren't quite perfect. And then when we replaced them with the CG ones, we still kept the shots as short as they had been, rather than sort of going, da-da, here's the CG spider, look at it. It was like, if you kind of go back and look, I think it always seems to sort of disappear almost before you've quite registered what it can do.
That's the fascinating thing about, the differences between Doctor Who then and now. It's very similar when you think about it, because they were wrestling with rubber spiders back in like 1974, but they were doing it in like multicam studio videotape. They didn't have the time or budget to sort of shoot it all on film and edit around it. So I love that, the presentation of Doctor Who in television in general is changed, but you're still fighting with rubber spiders, 40 years later. That's what I find just so great and wonderful about Doctor Who. But then you went into the studio after Lanzarote and shot inside the late Michael Pickwood's great moon base set.
Absolutely.
And a lot of low light stuff. I mean, how tricky is that these days, I suppose, or is it tricky at all to sort of shoot in such low light where it's basically just the lights of the space helmets are basically the only lighting source you have in some of those scenes before they find the light switch to turn them on?
It's as tricky as your director of photography wants to make it, and Ashley made it very, very simple. He believed, he was very happy to see to use those, the practical lights inside the helmets and the torches as the principal light sources. And then, we sort of went for that feeling of the actors as the light source, that sort of X-Files feeling, I guess. Mm-hmm. And, he put the little hairs across the back of the lens to get that horizontal flare. And it was very exciting. I mean, it was really cramped and really hot, and everything kept breaking, and it was quite a tricky day just to get things done. But the lighting was probably the least tricky thing. It was more the helmets and the breathing, and I don't know. Right. I just remember it. I remember it as a very... and Scott, the first AD, was fighting fires left, right, and centre on that day, and staying cool and staying good-tempered. But it was quite a tricky day.
Well, you mentioned Ashley Rowe, the DOP. Do you get to choose your director of photography, and like what kind of relationship does a director have with their DOP? Or I suppose in your case,
you
anyway.
do get to choose, or I did, and we had a lovely relationship. I mean, Ashley's very creative, very calm, very inspiring. Just a joy to be around, and he made it seem very simple.
Right. So do you just sort of tell him?
Which it is.
Yeah, you just tell him like, I want this shot, and then he does it. Like, what is the relationship, I suppose, between a director and a DOP in general? I think is my question. Maybe
I think you do. I think a lot of the work happens before you start filming, where you're kind of talking about things that you find inspiring or looking for references and just thinking about what it's going to be like. Then when you're actually filming, the DOP is principally thinking about the lighting, and then the director and the operator and the DOP together are all thinking about the shots and the shot flow. So you're kind of in the middle of a triangle between lighting, framing, and performance, and staging. Mm-hmm. Is that a triangle or a square?
Square triangle, I think.
There's like, what are the actors going to do? Where are they going to be? Where's the light going to come from? Where's the camera going to be? How's the camera going to move in relation to the actors to tell the story? And between the group of you, actors, DOP, operator, director, you're kind of trying to find a mutually satisfying answer.
Mm. Here's a nerdy and specific question, I suppose. One of my favorite shots in the episode is just as Clara and her two friends sort of do this climactic run down a corridor with explosions going down. The camera sort of swoops in real time right up to Jenna Coleman, and then it slows down as they start running down the corridor. And I was watching that and going, so are you shooting that at like a higher frame rate so that when you slow it down, it's not like you're like doing slow motion video, or like what is the technical trickery of doing a shot like that?
Yeah, that's the best way. If you do it at the higher frame rate, and we shoot 25p, so it's like the best way to hide it is to do 50 or 75 frames a second, and then you can do a speed ramp in the edit. I can't remember whether we did that in that case or whether we shot it at normal speed and then slowed it down. It depends whether the slow-mo looks invisible or not, but it's too long ago for me to remember what we did, but it would be one or other. And that was Alf Tremontin on Steadicam, who comes in from time to time and is kind of an amazing Steadicam operator. And it was a bit of a naughty shot because it kind of goes in and then pulls back, and it's sort of a little bit tromboning, but it felt fun and right, partly because it was trying to get as much out of people running down a corridor with everything exploding and fire going on. Right. It was just like one of those moments where you go, this is like the essence of Doctor Who.
It is. Yeah, it was a very exciting shot and a very heroic moment for Clara as well. And Jenna Coleman, who, the final scene, I suppose, in the TARDIS where she has it out with the Doctor is just some truly intense acting.
Absolutely.
How do you sort of shoot that scene? Because, it's not just Jenna Coleman giving it her all, but like Peter Capaldi's reactions are as equally important, as short and perfunctory as they are sometimes. Like when in the final scene, you cut back really quickly, just even with Capaldi saying yes, which is equally important and stuff. Like, how do you sort of shoot that scene? And are the actors like both giving it their all, even though one of them is not going to be on camera the whole time? And they describe the process, I suppose.
Yes, they were both giving it their all for the audience and for each other. So I think that, they're the kind of actors who are not going to just be turning it on when it's their shot and then sort of taking their foot off the pedal when they're not being filmed. They were both supporting each other. But it was one of those scenes where you suddenly, I think Jenna took us, I don't know if she took herself by surprise or if she knew what was going to happen when the scene played out. But I mean, I think it became more than it had been when it was written. And you kind of suddenly realized, I think because she treated it as real, and you can get sucked into the just telling a story, and it's like, it's an exciting story and it's got this and it's got that. But then there was something happened when she was doing that scene where it didn't seem like a story, and it seemed like the rupture in a really powerful relationship. And she, she was properly vulnerable and raw and full of pain. And it was a very kind of delicate day, really, because it's then all about just catching that. Yeah, I guess. And Peter was I think that the harshness of what he did was also quite a surprise, and may have been what slightly kind of unlocked something in her, because it was, you sort of expect a little bit of accommodation or kind of trying to make life easier for her, and he didn't do that. There was a kind of brutality. Anyway, and it's that thing where actors feed each other, and they were both just amazing. It was a lovely day. When they were sort of like doing a read through or run through of the scene, obviously they're not, or maybe they are going to go like that far. I mean, are you sometimes surprised with like just the difference between the run through version of a scene when the actors can't really give it their full emotion? Like if Jenna Coleman starts shedding a tear, there's going to be makeup and stuff, and that has to sort of be changed. I mean, is there a big change, I suppose, between like a run through or rehearsal of a scene compared to what the actual scene is when you actually shoot it? In that case, yes. And I think it was one of the things that I found, some people like to kind of rehearse and nail down exactly what they're going to do. They didn't. They were both very happy, as long as the rehearsal effectively gave you a sense of where people were going to be and when they were going to move, and so that we could work out lighting and camera positions. They'd hold back emotionally until the cameras were running, and effectively not waste anything. Those things, when the chemistry happens, it doesn't always happen over and over and over and over again. And it's better if it happens when you're filming, and so you can all kind of not only experience it but take it home and put it in the edit. So that was what happened. So I think we all felt aware of the fact that as we were filming, something was going on that was slightly more powerful than you have a right to expect.
Uh-huh.
You see what I mean? It's always a good day when that happens.
Yeah. So I mentioned the editing of the scene too, with the the back and forth a little bit. Are you? I mean, how active are you in the editing process for any episodes or TV that you work on? Is it a standard thing? I've spoken with Rachel Talalay, who's worked on both sides of the Atlantic, and
Sure.
Britain is very much an auteur's dream.
We have a lovely time here. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas she's basically a collector of footage when she works on stuff in North America. But what are your experiences on working with editing?
No, we had a lovely time. So I was working with John Richards on these two, who's an editor I've worked with on Strike Back and also on Da Vinci's Demons, and who's very experienced, very wise, and has a terrific touch. And so he would be working individually and independently whilst we're shooting, making his assembly, his sort of first assembly, and trying to make the best use of the footage that we've foraged for. Mm-hmm. But then we have a decent amount of time sitting together where we can go through and explore and sort of try and finesse things and look at other ways sometimes, or sometimes just go, great, that's what you've done is what I was hoping. And most of the time it is like that. And then the other people get involved. Stephen would come in and watch, and then he'd have his thoughts, or he'd ask questions, or he'd make suggestions, and then we'd try and accommodate those and try and use those to improve things. But it's like being able to be there for the edit is one of the great things about working in Britain,
amongst other things. So we'll move on to Mummy and the Orient Express, which is a very different production, all shot in studio for the most part, on a tiny set, which looks as big as it is on screen. Essentially, you have Jenna Coleman for one day, I think, because she was busy shooting Flatline with Douglas McKinnon's team. And you had Frank Skinner, who is a big, giant Doctor Who nerd. So all these things add up to what was a very entertaining story. What are your memories of Mummy and the Orient Express? It
was basically a delightful experience. One of the smaller things, but there was the whole thing about having a singer on the train, mm-hmm. and Foxes turned out to be a fan of Doctor Who and keen to be involved. And then there was we went sort of around the houses a little bit trying to choose what song she might sing, and landed on Don't Stop Me Now. And Brian May is a big Doctor Who fan and was happy for it to be used.
That's cool.
And then there was only one day when she could film. So we had to separate her close-ups and the shots of her singing. We had to do at a separate time without the Doctor and without Clara and without the audience. And then we had to do the shots from behind her with the room, uh-huh. with a stand-in pretending to be Foxes. But we had to do it the other way around. So we had to do that first, mm-hmm. and then shoot Foxes later. And at that stage, I hadn't seen her do her version of it, but Pete Bennett had seen her rehearsing the song and did a kind of version of the dance that she did. And then we got her double to copy Pete's copy of Foxes' dancing, and it turned out to be really good. Pete turned out to have absolutely nailed her hand movements and all of that, and that all joined together pretty well.
What were the limitations, I suppose, that you had to deal with having to shoot in a corridor, where you saw the walls, you saw the roof? I mean, was the set had windows in it and stuff, but did it also have the option to sort of take out a wall to be able to get some?
We could take walls off.
Uh-huh.
The main advantage of shooting in a constrained set like that was that we could only shoot with one camera. And I say and it just meant that the whole episode is basically a single camera episode. And British television and most television these days is shot with 2 or 3 cameras. And when you're doing that, you're not always able, I mean, you know, in a perfect world, both cameras are shooting exactly what you want them to be shooting, but they're sometimes slightly compromised by angles or space, or, you know, so you can end up with material that isn't exactly what you are after. Whereas when you're shooting single camera, it means everything is kind of very precisely controlled. And I think that gave it a particularly pleasing quality. Mm. It also meant that Ashley was sort of keen to use sort of noir lighting, I guess, and to get that sort of a mixture of strangers on a train or sort of Hitchcockian feel. Yeah. Not just Agatha Christie, because Agatha Christie, your feeling about the lighting in Agatha Christie is that it's a bit glossier, or mine is. And so we were trying to get something a little bit more from that darker version of the 30s. And I think he did that. I think he nailed that. The windows was fairly straightforward because it was in space. So it was just a matter of having either starcloths or Sykes outside. And then when we were in the main carriage and the mummy was walking up and down and chasing people, we did some work where we took the side off the carriage, laid track along at a distance, and then we're doing kind of quite long tracking shots as if the camera could sort of see inside, kind of like, I don't know, almost like I was just watching that Wes Anderson thing, Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou last night. Yeah. And there's that sort of sense of a cut-off, a cross-sectional set where you can move through bulwarks and through layers, was one of the things that we did in Mummy. Mm-hmm. And I really, that was really enjoyable because there was something quite old school about that.
Yeah. I'm curious actually by the, your mention about how there's 2 or 3 cameras often on TV productions. Now, what, how is that shot? I mean, obviously you're not switching between them at all. Are those other cameras sort of just getting reaction shots or something like that?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's like in a perfect world, sometimes if the lighting allows, and in a very emotional scene, you might cross shoot and you might have 2 close-ups and matching. So, you know, in a scene that's very emotional, being able to catch both actors in real time with each other can be very useful. Mm-hmm. In action sequences, it's often very important to have 2 or 3 cameras. Because in sort of chases or gunfights or explosions and things. In Doctor Who, we would quite often, as I remember it, so Mark McCoy would be a camera operator, and then Ashley would be shooting, he would be lighting, but also shooting. And in general, your A camera, you'd set to have the shot that you wanted, and B camera would be looking for what else can it get, which might be a profile, or it might be down the same line but with a different frame size. Mm-hmm. Or it might be, as you say, a reaction or kind of, you know, details around the scene, so that you might still you tell the main story always with the A camera and use the B camera to make sure that there are other things that the A camera wouldn't have time to see that you'll want in the edit. There are different strategies, and it depends partly on time, and it depends partly on the size of the set, and it also depends whether it's an emotional scene or an action scene.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
The other thing you can sometimes do is having cameras in different places within a set, where you'll have actors moving off one camera and coming around a corner and onto another camera, and that can be very effective just to sort of avoid having to break things into too many little bits. Uh-huh. And helpful for actors, I think, so their energy can be up and you know, they can move like things are happening in real time.
That's I just find it fascinating how, you know, because I grew up on classic Doctor Who where it's shot multicam, and often actors are going from one part of the set to a different set, and it's happening in real time as well.
Absolutely,
I find it great.
That still happens, and we can, you know, you can still use that. But as you say, you know, the difference is that there'll be plenty of time to shoot other material as well, and then to sit, you know, for a number of weeks editing. So all of those different strategies get used at different times on different days and in different sequences.
That warms my heart that that current TV production hasn't moved as far afield from classic Doctor Who production as I thought it might have. Speaking of classic Who, I mentioned Frank Skinner before, who's a big Doctor Who fan, and I do have to ask, because I know he alluded to it in the Doctor Who extra, because that leaving scene was terrible for him, because how dare you, when I say you, how dare you shoot a scene where the biggest Doctor Who fan ever has to shoot a scene where he's actually offered a part on the TARDIS and has to turn it down. And he lamented that perhaps maybe one take he could say yes. Did you ever end up shooting a take where Frank Skinner says, "Yes, I will stay"?
Yeah, I'm sure we did. I'm trying to remember. I know he said it. Whether it was in rehearsal or whether we shot it, I can't remember. I think we must have done, because it was such a perfect moment, and he was so full of. Clearly, it's like it was very, very painful for him to have to turn it down. But it was lovely. It was nice to have someone living their own particular personal dream so exquisitely, and being so full of just joy to be there every day.
Yeah, it looked like he was really enjoying himself, and it was a great performance. And there's a slight sort of, he's letting on more than, he almost feels like a Time Lordy performance in a way, and that he's sort of he's been looking into it already. And I thought that he and Peter Capaldi formed a nice bond, and it didn't feel like it was, you were sort of replacing Jenna Coleman because she was barely there because she was shooting something else. It just felt like a natural fit between Capaldi and Skinner, I thought.
Yeah, no, he's a very clever man, Frank. I'd done a couple of documentaries with him 10 years earlier, maybe. He has a number of obsessions, one of which is Doctor Who, another is Elvis Presley. And we'd done a documentary where he'd bought a blue velvet shirt that was meant to have belonged to Elvis in an auction, and had then discovered that it might not be real. And we drove around the States from Memphis and Tupelo through to Nashville and Hawaii and Los Angeles, and ended up in Vegas, and did this kind of journey meeting people who knew Elvis to try and verify whether the shirt was real or not. And so I'd got to know him quite well doing that. And it was lovely to kind of meet up again and spend some time in this other world.
Right.
And with another of his dreams coming true.
So the mummy itself, which is terrifying, and was so terrifying that the BBC couldn't even use it in their trailer. The episode itself went out a lot later. I think it went out at like 8:37 in the evening, which is the latest the Doctor Who.
Yeah, we were
really,
really proud of that. That was very exciting, really, to make an episode of Doctor Who that was too scary to be shown at the right time.
that has to lead to some of the allure, like, children watching. Oh, I shouldn't be watching this, which makes it even more imperative that I do watch it. How involved were you in sort of the design and feel and concept of the mummy itself?
Yeah, pretty involved. I mean, it was like it was something we kicked around quite a lot, and I had quite strong views about the kind of mummy that I wanted. I wanted something, well, basically what we got. I wanted something that felt real, that felt like it had died, that felt organic, and rotting, that had, I didn't a kind of, something that was too panto or too much. I think the old Universal Studios mummy is it's more bandages than decay. And I think they did an amazing job with the jaw and the teeth and that sense of the bandages where they've gone almost like the bandage has decayed and you can see through it. But the whole thing, really, I mean, it's like it was partly the prosthetics and partly the design of the costume, but a lot of it was just Jamie Hill, who did the movement, who's a movement artist who's done quite a lot of work on Doctor Who as different monsters. I just think he was just wonderful, and sort of the slowness of his move, the dragged foot, and the way his hand comes up very slowly to make the point. He was very expressive and disciplined, And so it became very simple, because then it's like, the slower he was, the more threatening he became. And that then made it kind of easy for us to photograph, because we had something that had all of this sort of baggage, but is chasing you very, very slowly. And that's really scary.
Mm-hmm. Were you conscious of the 66-second countdown that was going to be on screen, and thus you couldn't cheat time? Like, you couldn't sort of extend a shot for dramatic purposes or shorten one, knowing that there's a literal clock timing that 66 seconds while you're shooting a thing.
Yeah, I'd love to take credit for that, but in fact, that is Stephen Moffat genius. That was one of those things. When we were shooting the Foretold chasing people, I was very happy to play around with time. So I was shooting, it's like I thought some of them could extend and get even more kind of, it's like, the 66 seconds would seem to be a minute and a half. And so I was shooting like over egging the pudding, or egging the pudding.
Right.
It's like whenever I was having a good time, it was like, let's just do more and more and more. And when we were editing, we played with the duration of some of them, and then Stephen was going, no, let's have a clock, and let's make it real. And so we had to make some of them substantially shorter to fit the 66 seconds. But it turned out that the reality of the time passing and seeing the countdown on screen was very, very powerful. And I was very happy with it. I was happy that he suggested it and that we ran with it.
Peter Capaldi looks. The costumes look great. Both he and Jenna Coleman look superb in Howard Burden's Art Deco costumes. But he brings a lot to the role, obviously. But I think my favorite thing was what was in his cigarette case. That was all his idea of the Jelly Babies, wasn't it?
That was totally his idea. That was a little something. He had a little something that he was gonna. He thought he might, have a go with and try out. And when he did, it was so exciting. He'd found a way to do a callback and make it his at the same time.
Yeah, because it wasn't the bag, or he had to would you like a jelly baby? He didn't even say, would you like a jelly baby?
He didn't say anything. Yeah, it's just there, and it was just like it, and it was and the cigarette case and the kind of the precision of the way they were laid out in the cigarette case. I just thought it was, and he was, and at the time, and because he's very interested in the history of acting and in the ways that people have done things and the way that that sort of, those classic actors and those studio actors used to work. And he was with, it was Christopher Villiers, who was the professor that he was talking to in that scene. Mm-hmm. And the two of them were having quite a long conversation about prop work and, how, getting that right and how tricky it can be. And it was like, and Peter was sort of practicing his hand movements around the box and how he got it and how he opened it and when he made the flourish. And it's all very kind of technical on the one hand, but also very light. It's very playful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was great. Christopher Villiers, of course, himself was in Doctor Who way back when in 1983, I think it was, as a young knight. So it's you with Tony Asoba, you have a history of people who have been in Doctor Who before coming back several decades later. Yeah,
and he's lovely, and I think he was very, very happy to be back and to be having a little moment there.
Mm-hmm. We move on to Last Christmas, the Christmas special of that year, and probably the scariest Christmas special I think that the Doctor Who has ever done. And I think Jenna Coleman was originally thinking she'd be leaving at the end of Series 8, but enjoyed working with Capaldi so much that she stayed on for at least the Christmas special. Yes. But then, so how late in the game did you realize that actually no, Jenna Coleman isn't leaving in this Christmas special, she's staying on for the next season? Quite late in the game, yeah. There was sort of conversations happening behind the scenes, and then it sort of suddenly became clear that everything was going to continue. And I think it adds a kind of quite a magical poignance to the ending, because the whole thing had been structured to be her goodbye. I think you actually feel like it is. Mm-hmm. And then there's a sort of like yet another twist. Right. Yeah, that's what made it so impactful at the time, because they hadn't officially announced it, but you just got the impression that perhaps Jenna Coleman would be going. She'd been on the show for 2 years. That seems to be a natural length of time for someone to be on the show as a companion, and it's building up to a finale that it feels like such a reward at the end when the Doctor goes one more time through the dream sequence and she's back and they run off again. I mean, it feels like a celebratory moment.
And I think and that celebration was sort of built on that feeling of not wanting to stop. So it was sort of expressing something that was true. Yeah. If you like. And that was very clever.
I mentioned scary. It is scary. Sort of building on the mummy prop. I thought the dream crabs were quite frightening, and there's a certain horror aspect to everything there. It was fun to scare the kids on Mummy and have it go out at 8:37 p.m. But this is Christmas Day, so was there a very conscious sort of thought process about, like, you want to make it scary, but realizing that this is probably going out like around dinner time on Christmas Day and having to sort of scale back things a bit?
No, I mean, there was never any talk about having to scale things back. Oh. I mean, I think the tone is the thing that allowed us to get away with it. If we hadn't had Nick Frost and Santa and the elves as well, if you stripped all of that out and all of the comedy and the sort of dream self-referentiality and the kind of the badinage, and had just done the Arctic base and the dream crabs, it would have been impossible. But somehow you could do all that because of all the gags and somehow get away with it. Right. But no, there was never an instruction to ease off. And I mean, my intention was to do justice to both sides of it, I guess, to make the comedy funny and to make the scares scary. And the dream crabs. So, I grew up on Alien and The Thing and all of that stuff. That's it, just embedded in your head. You can't, I particularly love The Thing because I think it's one of the most gruesome and mind-blowing films. And I still remember the first time I saw it. I think John Carpenter is a very, 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 very clever man. Mm-hmm. And Adam Trotman, who was the editor on this, is probably the biggest sci-fi nerd that I've ever met in my life. Uh-huh. He was obsessed, sort of sci-fi and horror, and he was obsessed with the possibility of burying references and just trying to kind of layer as much sort of cleverness for his own pleasure, really. Uh-huh. In addition to everything that Stephen had already put in the script, and that all of us in trying to kind of think of, how to put together the ideas for the dream crabs and for, I don't know, for the base and for the feeling of it. And there was a lot of discussion. I mean, we had a moment in prep on this where we were thinking about whether we could do a Lanzarote with the Arctic. Uh-huh. And was there a way to make it feel real? And we explored going to Iceland, and we explored possibly going to an ice cave there. And then the more that the script came through, the more it became clear that actually everything interesting happened. It happened inside the base. Mm-hmm. And there really wasn't. And I remember there was a pre-production meeting where I was sort of presenting some of the images of Iceland, and we were all really excited, and we were sort of looking at them, and we, it's like teams understandably always like to get away from the studio and go somewhere exciting and be paid to do it. All of us were sort of looking at these and going, "Wow, this looks great!" And then and Stephen went, "So what do you think? Do you think it's justified?" And I went, "I hate to say this, but I really don't think it is, because I think everything that's actually in this script, we can do better in the studio, and I'm not sure it needs it."
And so, and it does look very effective. I mean, it is a moon base. That's it's kind of similar, just sort of shooting the entire episode in that moon base from I said moon base. I'm an Arctic base from Kill the Moon because it's very claustrophobic. That's the thing. There's just this feeling of claustrophobia when you can see the studio roof for some reason. I don't know what it is about claustrophobic studio sets, but I thought it was very effective. Yeah.
And the point when they do come out and then they get rescued by Santa and jump in the sleigh and the sleigh flies away had so much artifice in it. Mm-hmm. And involved, this sort of the beginning of a magical sleigh ride, that it felt better to do that in a studio. And so we had quite a big studio set with, giant chunks of ice that had been made by Michael and his team, and then an old-fashioned cyc in the distance. But it meant we could control the light, and it meant we could shoot, because this really did have to be in the dark. You couldn't do that in daytime. It was all happening at night in Stephen's script. Mm-hmm. And for reasons that became clear when, as it all finished. And that was the thing in the end that sort of clinched it, was to go to Iceland might have been possible, and we might have found snow and ice there, but we wouldn't have been able to go there and film at night and build a set and then have a flying sledge.
Right.
And I think also there's a sort of a sense in which creating your own world and designing your own world when it's that far from people's experience and from reality, sort of felt right, especially as it turns out in the end that it is all a dream.
It is. Plus, Iceland in August or whatever you shot is there's not a lot of nighttime hours at that time of year either.
There's not a lot of nighttime hours, and there isn't actually a lot of ice either.
No.
So I think we were better off. It's like, so Danny Hargreaves and his team were pumping snow, and we could control it. And again, we couldn't have gone there and then taken snow machines. Mm. And so, there are a lot of practical reasons why we ended up doing it all in Cardiff Bay.
Yeah. Speaking of snow, I just want to mention that the technology on creating snow in the UK has improved greatly over the years. And I can say that being from Western Canada, where I'm looking outside and there's still snow on the ground. So kudos to your team for making convincing snow. It doesn't always happen in Hollywood still to this day. So good job on that.
Well, there were a lot of conversations about which kind of snow to have. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we had different kinds of snow in different scenes, but some of it is bubbles, and some of it are little ash particles, and some of them were some of it sort of you can touch, and some of it disappears and gets wet and smeary. But I think each bit worked at the time that it had to. And I remember, because Neville Kidd was the DOP on this episode, and we're trying to make sure that the windows of the Arctic base set had snow falling outside them and light coming through that snow. And it was strangely complicated and difficult to get exactly right, often just to be a small thing in the back of a shot. But it really helps to trick your mind into believing. I think there's something about the stuff that happens in the corner of your eye or in the corner of a set that sometimes is sort of quite critical to, suspending disbelief.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of suspending disbelief, the dream sequence, most of it's a dream sequence when you think about it, but the explicit dream sequence where Clara is with Danny Pink again, mm-hmm. The look of those scenes is entirely different, and I love watching the close-ups of all the characters in that, because the Christmas lights in behind are in such soft focus that they just feel like they're just circles and stuff. What did you use different lenses, or like longer lenses, and what kind of lighting was it? Was it a different?
So no, they're not longer lenses. They're different lenses. So Neville ordered sort of discussed this in prep, that purely for the dream sequence, he got a different set of Cooke lenses which are faster. So they open up to they have a wider aperture when they're fully open. I think they go to 1.2, and it gave us that very, very dreamy softness, mm-hmm. and very sort of precise plane of focus that just hovers around the eyes, and then everything falls away, and all the Christmas lights, really, you get giant circles of confusion from them. It was an inspired choice, and it really helps, because there's nothing else to signpost that it's a different reality, a different layer of reality, but just accept that the lenses are different. and obviously in the story that there's a character who's died is walking around and talking.
Right.
But I thought it was very clever. So that was, and that was, I think Neville suggested that quite early on, and it seemed very like a really lovely way to do it. And then he was operating for that crucial conversation when Peter and Jenna and Sam are standing there in the living room, and she has to wake up, and he's kind of, he makes the speech. And I think Neville operated for that, and there was just this kind of very slightly floaty handheld feeling to it. I thought it was very gorgeous.
It was indeed, and it's probably my favorite Christmas special, which is interesting because it's my second favorite is probably the Christmas Carol, which is a very different feeling. But it's
I love that.
Yeah,
yes.
It just shows that Doctor Who could do all sorts of different things when it comes to Christmas specials. But here we are speaking in April of 2020, and to date, that's your last episode of Doctor Who, 3 in one go. Have you ever had an inkling to perhaps return to the show?
Yeah, no, I mean it's one of those weird things where everything gets. It's like, I think that year doing those 3 was one of the happiest working years of my life. When I'd finished the Christmas special, I'd sort of agreed to go on to something else in Morocco, and I went off to do that, which was a thing set in Jerusalem and just after the crucifixion for NBC called AD, and that had a big battle in the temple and Romans and centurions and things. And then I went off to do Indian Summers, and I just sort of got out of sync with it. And who knows? It was a lovely experience. I'd always be keen to go back if the opportunity arises.
Well, I hope the opportunity arises, and I hope that any opportunity arises for the TV industry, the film industry, and indeed life itself to sort of get back to normal. But I'm grateful for the slowdown, if only that I gave me a chance to talk to you about your time on Doctor Who. So thanks, Paul, for joining me today.
Hey, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I hope it hasn't been too boring, but I've enjoyed it. It's really nice to sort of revisit all of this and think about it. It seems like such a long time ago, but it isn't really. But let's hope that this all comes to an end as soon as possible.
Thank you, Paul. It's great talking to people who make Doctor Who. I will say that,
especially
upfront.
2 in 1 episode.
2 in 1 episode. I just our love affair with directors on this show is well renowned, and I just love getting down to grips with the nuts and bolts of actual proper television making. It's a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed that interview. One thing I should mention, which I skipped over 2 hours ago, is that the Hugo Award finalists were announced this past week for the virtual convention that will be Con Zealand in New Zealand in late July, early August. And there's a Doctor Who connection as well as a personal connection. Once again, Resolution, the only Doctor Who episode which aired in 2019, and thus the only one that was eligible to be nominated and be a finalist, is a finalist. It's Doctor Who Resolution, which was nominated for Best Dramatic Presentation Short Form. Although Good Omens was also an episode of Good Omens, or the whole series, I can't remember which.
But yeah, I was going to say Doctor Who is up against a couple episodes of Watchmen, and
much as I like Resolution, if the episode that's the origin of Hooded Justice doesn't win, it is an absolute crime. That is the best thing I saw on TV, bar none.
Wow!
And the Good Place won last year, if memory serves, and they're nominated again, as well as The Mandalorian, which obviously the Baby Yoda love is strong out there in the universe and might carry some weight.
True. It's interesting.
It's actually going to be a really interesting category to watch, because between the fact 2 Watchmen episode got nominated and Mandalorian, Doctor Who, etc., there's some good potential for vote splitting.
All those things are good.
Yeah.
All those things are good. The Watchmen, that one particular Watchmen episode is stellar.
Yeah.
So
I find intriguing the best dramatic presentation long form, just because there are two series, Good Omens and Russian Doll, a series as a whole, as a dramatic presentation, as opposed to using just one episode, which I find quite intriguing.
Well, that's what the new novel is now. So
true.
And the last Star Wars film was in there, and I don't see that winning. Don't see that winning.
Probably not. Also, for the 5th year running, Uncanny Magazine is finalist for Best Semi-Prozine. Erica and I are on the team for Uncanny Magazine, so thanks everyone for nominating us and everything. It'll be every year has been different. For the first one we watched live streaming, the second one was in Finland and there was no live stream, so we found out on Twitter. Basically, the third one we were there in San Jose to actually accept them in person, and last year we watched live as well on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Ireland. So it'll be weird because the whole convention will be online, and I imagine the Hugo Awards will be too, so it'll be an interesting experience. And on August 2nd, I think, is probably when the Hugos actually happen, which is the last day of the convention. So yes, full list of all the Hugo finalists is in the show notes of this very podcast. Next week, you heard the man himself talk about his episodes of Doctor Who. You will hear the three of us talk about his episodes. Paul Wilmshurst is in the Miniscope. Kill the Moon, Mummy on the Orient Express, and Last Christmas we will hash out and talk about on the next episode of Radio Free Skaro. So do join us for that. And until then, I am Stephen in Edmonton.
Warren in Vancouver.
And Chris in Edmonton.
So long for now.
You've been listening to Radio Free Skaro. Find us online at radiofreeskaro.com, follow us on Twitter and Tumblr at Radio Free Skaro, subscribe to us on iTunes, and donate to the show at patreon.com/Radio Free Skaro. Thank you.